Hello. In this exercise, we're going to take the Stripe Universal Connector for Salesforce, and we're going to show how we can sync customers from Stripe to accounts in Salesforce. In this exercise, we're going to create flows and then automate those flows. That way, every time there is a creation or update event of an account, or of a customer inside of Stripe, that we update the corresponding account inside of Salesforce in real time. First, I'm going to navigate to my Salesforce instance. From here, I'm going to open up the Stripe app. Here I can see I've got my Stripe connector for Salesforce. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. I should already have an account selected and ready for use. I'll go ahead and select an account I've been working with in other various demos and videos. And once we have this account selected, I just want to ensure that I have the correct webhooks set up and enabled for this exercise. So I'm going to go to Enabled Webhook Events. I'm going to ensure that I have Customer Created and Customer Updated set up. If these events have not been configured, go ahead and click on All Webhook Events, navigate to Stripe Object Customer, and then from here, go ahead and select the correct events to listen to, which are Customer Created and Customer Updated. Once you've done this, just simply click Save. Once the save is complete, navigate to your Stripe dashboard, go to Developers, and then click on Webhooks. Ensure that the hosted endpoint's actually been created and is actually listening for the events that we've configured. Now that we know that we have an account added and the correct events are being listened for, let's go ahead and go back to Setup. From Setup, we need to ensure that we have the appropriate permissions to work with the Stripe API. From here, we're going to simply go to Users, and we're going to go to the user we're logged in as. From here, we're going to go to Permission Sets Assignments, and just simply edit assignments. Here, what we're looking for is Stripe Data Connector User and Stripe Connector Integration User. Once I have those added, I'm simply going to click Save. Now that I've ensured my user has the appropriate permission sets to actually work with the Stripe connector, I'm going to go ahead and open up Flow. I'm going to create a new flow. And the type of flow I'm going to create is a record triggered flow. We do this because the events that get fed into the Salesforce organization get put into a table. So we can actually use that table for standard CRUD activities. So if we monitor that table for creation events, we can actually use those events to key off of to perform actions based on things that happen inside of Stripe. All events are funneled into the same table, so it's important to denote what events we're listening for to drive individual flows downstream. As mentioned, the Stripe object, or the object we want to work with, is Stripe Events. So from here, I just select Stripe Events, and this is where all Stripe events get funneled to. The only trigger I'm really going to be worried about here is when a record's created, as these records don't actually get updated. They only get created and deleted by the automatic table cleanup. I'm going to set a few entry conditions, and the conditions I'm going to set are I want to key off of the record type. And by record type, I mean the Stripe event name. And when we're thinking of the Stripe event name, what we're concerned with here are the customer created and customer updated events that we were looking for when we created our webhook. So to look at Stripe event name, we simply come down here and we make sure that we're selecting event name. Note, there's also the Stripe event name here, but this is the default built-in name inside of Salesforce that gets created. What we actually need to select is this event name here. All I'm going to do is simply say equals customer.created. Then I'm added another condition. And for this condition, I'm actually going to say is live mode. Think of it as we're checking to make sure that this event's coming from a test instance because we only want to affect test data. If this is true, then we know that the record or the event that got placed on this table is actually from Stripe in a live account. If this is false, we know it came from a test account. This is extremely useful when you're listening to webhook events from a production account because production accounts see all test and live events. So ensure you're using this if you have a live webhook listener. A common mistake that can be made here is when we come in and look at the account. You'll see a Stripe account here, and some think that this is the Stripe account ID out inside of Stripe. However, this is the Stripe account ID inside of Salesforce. So if you know the actual record name inside of Salesforce or the corresponding ID to the record, you could actually place that here if you wanted to listen to a single record. But just note that when we watch some users attempt this exercise, they want to put in the account and their actual account number that is their Stripe account ID. They're not the same thing. So just be mindful of that when you're creating these, or you might not be able to get a flow to execute properly. The last thing we want to check is we want to include a run asynchronous path. We want to do this just in case we want to call back out the Stripe to fetch additional data. Now, that will ensure that our conditions are proper, and we see that we're looking for event name or customer.created, and we're also looking for is live mode is false or unchecked in this case because it's just a standard checkbox on the record, making sure that those match. We'll go ahead and click done. Now that we have a flow set up to run, every time a Stripe event is fired, and every time a Stripe event is fired means that there was an action taken or an event created inside of Stripe when a customer is created. So that's when this flow will actually trigger, is when a customer was created inside of Stripe. The next thing we can do with Stripe events is cast them to objects. If you're familiar with programming, we have the ability to cast objects from different maps and things like that, or objects inside of that programming language. Very similar here to when an event comes in to the Stripe event table, we can actually take the event body and we can cast that to a native object. That way we can work with it as if it was a standard Salesforce object inside of Flow. So here I'll just simply go ahead and click an action, and then I'll pull up the Stripe cast event. We actually have the ability to cast to almost every single object that exists inside of Stripe. So you'll see a lot of options here. This is on purpose. One, it allows us to cast events to any object that come through the event piece, or we can actually use a raw base call and cast those to events as well. But for this exercise, we're looking to cast to customer. So I'm just going to go ahead and say cast to customer. And in the naming scheme, you'll see a couple things. One, you'll see that it's Stripe to denote that that's us. And then the other thing is, remember when a couple exercises ago, or when you installed, you had to select the API version you wanted to work with. If you have more than one API version, you'll actually have more than one cast to customer, but you'll see the API version denoted in the name. In this case, it's 2020-08-27. Now that I've selected the cast to customer, I'm just going to say create customer object. And then you can see this only has one input, and it's called request body. This just happens to map very well to the event itself. So if I go ahead and say, hey, I want to look at the record that's been passed through, and I want to pass in the event body, So if I just simply scroll down here to request body, and I select the request body here, you can see there's pretty close mapping because this is what this was intended to use or be used for. So now that I have this set up, I'll simply click done. So now just to recap, every time a customer is created in Stripe, a record gets created inside of Salesforce on the Stripe event table. We're looking for records where customer was created, and then we're casting those records to customer objects inside of Salesforce. The next piece we want to do is actually create an account. So we're going to select create record. In here, we're just going to say create account. We only want to create one record, and we're going to use separate resources and values. We're going to go ahead and select the account object. Now, there could be lots of ways to do this in your own environment or in a sort of custom deployment that you were doing. Maybe you want to actually create custom objects that map into the accounts or something similar like that, where maybe you'd have a many-to-one relationship, or you'd have many customers to one account, or different things like that. In this example, it's going to be a one-to-one mapping, and we're only going to map 2 fields, just to give you an idea of how this can be done and actually how easy this is to do. So from here, we're going to go ahead and select account number. And what we're going to map to account number is the Stripe ID. So when we're inside of Stripe and we're working with a customer, those customers have unique IDs, and we're going to make a one-to-one mapping between Stripe ID and account number, just so we have a relationship to look up later on. And also, we didn't want to create any custom fields or complicate the exercise. So think of this as the most rudimentary way to create that bidirectional lookup. So from here, I'll go ahead and select the create customer object, as this is the output from the cast that we did. You'll notice as soon as I select this, all the values that I have available to me are values directly out of the Stripe API for that object. So for this, I'm just going to select ID. And now I'm setting the account number to the actual customer ID. And then I'm going to just set the name for the account to the name of the customer. All right, now that we have a simple mapping set up to where we're mapping the Stripe ID to the account number and the Stripe name of the customer to the account name, I'm just going to go ahead and click done. The next piece we'll do is we'll just go ahead and simply say save to save our workflow. I'm going to go ahead and click activate. All right, let's navigate back to our Stripe account dashboard. Once we're in dashboard, we're just going to create a customer to test the flow. We'll name our customer test sync, just so it's very apparent that this is the customer that we used for our example. All right, now that we've populated a little bit of data, I'll go ahead and say create customer. Now, if that customer has been added, I can navigate back into Salesforce. And what I want to do is be in setup, and I'm going to go back to the Stripe connector application. Once I'm in here, I'm going to go ahead and click on Stripe events. And I'm looking for the latest event. Once I click on this event, I can see that the event name was customer created. And I can also see that this was the customer that we created because I can see this is a test of our flow. I can see it's tsync, and the name of the customer was test sync. Now that I'm in accounts, I can actually see that I have an account called test sync. if I click on details, I can see that the customer number is a Stripe account ID. And if I go back into our Stripe dashboard, I can compare the two IDs and know that the syncing was actually successful. So we've successfully created a real-time update push from Stripe to Salesforce every time a customer is created. This could benefit e-commerce sites or any sort of custom flow where Stripe might be interacting with customers out of band of Salesforce, but you want to create a record of that interaction inside of Salesforce as well. The next flow I want to create is every time an update's made to a customer, I want that update to propagate down to Salesforce as well. So I'm going to go back into Salesforce. We're going to go ahead and create a new flow. Similar to before, we're going to create a record triggered flow. And again, in this flow, we're going to be listening for Stripe events. Once I've selected Stripe events, I'm going to say when a record is created. I'm also going to create my conditions again. But in this time, when I'm looking for the event name, I'm actually going to say customer.updated. The next condition is the same as before, and that's going to be for live mode. And we're just going to say equals false. Again, since all Stripe events go into a single record or single object, what we do on each subsequent flow is we just filter them out. So on this one, this flow will only run on customer update events, as opposed to the other flow that we just created that was looking at customer.new events. I'm going to go ahead and say include the asynchronous run, again, just in case I wanted to call back out to Stripe. Now that we have our flow configured, I'm going to go ahead and do the same cast to action that we did in the previous one. Okay, same as before, I'm just going to call this create customer object. And then the request body is, once again, as before in the exercise, is the record that we are passing through, and it's the request body of the record. And I'll simply say done. Now that we've created our customer object to work with, let's put in just a little bit of logic to make sure that the record exists inside of Salesforce prior to trying to issue an update. So for here, we're going to go ahead and do a get record. I'm sorry, get account. And for the object, we're going to say it's account. As you remember, in the examples that we did, or in the first example we did in the exercise, when we created the accounts automatically, we were using account number with the Stripe ID. We're going to leverage that field for the lookup. So since that should be a one-to-one relationship in this example, we can say when account number equals customer ID. Since Stripe doesn't duplicate IDs, there should never be any duplicates here. So when we find an account, we should be able to write it. For this, I'm just going to go ahead and say done. And then we need to put a simple decision in here. I'm going to give the record a simple label called "Do we have an account?" And for this label, I'm going to say no. And we're going to add one more operation here and say yes. Now let's put a simple condition in. And what we're looking for here is account from get account. And we're going to say is null. And if is null is true, we know nothing was returned. And then we'll do the similar thing for yes, where we'll look at get account. Is null false. So a simple check to see if any records essentially were returned in our fetch record. Now that we have decision set up, we're going to walk through this and set a couple different paths. The first being, do we have an account? And if the answer is yes, all we want to do is update a record. Now that we've set this to update a record, I'm actually going to specify conditions in the record to update. I'm going to select account. And we're going to use the same conditional logic for account number equals customer ID. And then for this update, since we're only updating one field, we're just going to make sure we update the name. So since we're only looking at two fields and we're only setting two fields, every time there's an update, we're going to assume it was a name update. I know the example is pretty rudimentary, but it does show how we can do this in any sort of setting we wanted to. Again, if we wanted to create a more advanced use case, we easily could, but in this case, we're only syncing name. Now that we have a result for the condition we're looking for, which is there's an account that exists that needs updated, let's create a path for when we do not have an account. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to create a record. This would essentially capture anything that was happening out of band on accounts that we didn't already know about. So if a user made an update to an account that didn't already exist in Stripe, for example, this would at least ensure that there was a happy path forward for that to capture that update. So we're just going to say create account. And again, we're just going to set the account number to the ID. And we're going to set the name to the customer name. Go ahead and click done. Now we have two paths for our flow to go down. So just to recap, when a customer is updated inside of Stripe, this flow gets fired. The first thing we do is we cast that event to an object that we can work with. We then fetch the accounts, or fetch the account inside of Salesforce. If the account doesn't exist, we'll go ahead and create a new record inside of Salesforce. If the account does exist, we'll just simply update the customer that's already there. So I'm going to go ahead and click save. I'm going to give the flow a name. say accounts from customers. Now that our flow is saved, I'm going to go ahead and click Activate. Now that my flow is activated, let's go back into the Stripe dashboard and see if this is working. From here, I'm going to navigate back into Customers. The first test I'm going to do is the positive path, meaning I know the record exists, and to do that I'm going to go ahead and click on Test Sync. And then I'm going to simply click Edit. And for the name, I'm going to say Update. And simply click Update Customer. Now that I know that that value's been modified, I'm going to go back into Salesforce. And I should be able to just simply refresh this account. And see that the account name has actually changed from Test Sync to Test Sync Update. So I know that the flow is working. Now if I navigate back into Stripe, let's test the negative condition. And the negative condition meaning I update a customer that doesn't already exist inside of Salesforce. For that, I'm going to go ahead and select one of the customers that I've already had. I'll go ahead and pick this Jane Doe account. Now that I've selected this, I'll just append new update. This will allow me to see if this account gets created properly. So we'll go ahead and click Update Customer. Now this should fire an event inside of Stripe saying this customer was updated. And if we navigate back into Salesforce, now that we're in accounts, I can see that Jane Doe new update does exist. So both the positive and the negative paths are working in our flow. This concludes this exercise. Thank you.